My name is Jim Soland, and I'm here to present a paper that I co-authored with Lindsay Fox and Susanna Loeb. The paper is essentially comparing whether or not teachers who are effective with their non-English learners are also effective with their English learners. And it's a paper that's about to come out in Education Evaluation, Policy and Analysis, a journal in the field. So basically, there's a lot of research being done these days on teacher effectiveness, and specifically on teacher value added, which estimates how much a teacher contributes to the gains a student makes on test scores from one year to the next. And despite the prevalence of this research and also the use of value added in a lot of settings, including school districts and states, to make somewhat high stakes decisions about teachers, there really hasn't been a lot of research done on whether or not teachers who are effective in general are also effective with student subgroups. And so we look at that in this case with English language learners. And we do that because it's a really fast-growing group with a lot of major educational challenges. So the purpose of the paper is to explore whether or not teachers who are effective with their English learners are also effective with their non-English learners. And in general, what we end up finding is that there aren't a whole lot of differences between effective teachers with one versus the other, but there are some differences, and those can be predicted by a few different teacher characteristics and training aspects, such as whether or not they have bilingual certification. So to get into a few of the details of how we actually conducted this study, we essentially estimated teacher value added for English learners and non-English learners separately, and we compared them. And as a broad measure, one of the problems we ran into is that it's not always clear whether or not these differences are statistically significant. And so we addressed this issue by taking a bootstrapping approach, where we just assigned teachers random students, called them English learners and non-English learners, estimated the value added, and then used that as a basis to say, are the real differences we're seeing between English learners and non-English learners comparable to those we see between just arbitrarily assigned students? So using this method, we try and address three specific research questions. The first is, are the variances of teacher effectiveness comparable for teachers with their English learners and their non-English learners? And so what does this really mean in practical terms? Well, so what you can see in the figure here is that if a teacher, or rather if a student has a teacher who's at one end of the distribution, say a low-performing teacher, but these distributions look a lot different, then having a teacher at one end of the distribution would mean something very different for one group versus the other. So for example, if the distribution is much wider and you have a teacher who's at the bottom end of the distribution, that means you would have a teacher who's less effective than a teacher at the same point in a much smaller distribution. So that's why we're interested in the variances between the teacher effectiveness estimates. And we end up looking at true estimates of these variances where we back out measurement error. And we use our bootstrapping approach of assigning randomly students to these teachers. And what we essentially find here is that the variances don't appear to differ. That in general, the spread of the distributions of teacher effectiveness are comparable across the two groups. So from there, we move on to this question of how effective are teachers with their English learners and non-English learners? And we get at that in a couple of different ways. The first is we correlate teacher value added estimates in reading and in math for their English learners with those same estimates for their non-English learners. And we also do cross tabulations, where we say we're going to divide the teachers into deciles and see if a teacher who's in the top decile with their English learners is also in, say, the top decile with their non-English learners. And here we end up finding that in general, teachers, again, who are effective with one tend to be effective with the other, but there are some differences that are discernible and different than the random runs that we did. And so this suggests that a good teacher with one student tends to be a good teacher with the other, but there may be differences, or in fact there are differences so far as we can tell in the effectiveness between these two groups. So finally we turn to this question of, we've observed some differences, can we actually predict what might make a teacher differentially effective with one student or one type of student versus the other? And so we do this by predicting student gains and seeing if a teacher who has a bilingual certification or is fluent in Spanish, if having those parts of training or those qualities end up predicting bigger gains with their English learners than non-English learners. And we do this by using a teacher fixed effect as well, which helps adjust for some of the non-random sorting of teachers to students and vice versa. And what we end up finding here is that both of these teacher characteristics end up predicting improved effectiveness with English learners. So if you have a teacher who's Spanish fluent, if you have a teacher who has a bilingual certification, they tend to produce bigger gains with their English learners. So what's the sum up here? There are a couple of big takeaways from this paper. The first is that if school districts are trying to make decisions about how to allocate their teachers to English learners to improve their outcomes, then the most important thing overall is just that they get an effective teacher. Whether or not it's based on English learners or non-English learners, you would want a high value-added teacher in those classrooms. However, if you're already trying to decide between two teachers who you think are pretty effective, then there are a few differences that might lead to differential effectiveness with English learners, such as the bilingual certification or being Spanish fluent. And both of those could be factors that might help school districts make these decisions.